I mean, would you agree that we just know so little about the human brain still to this day?
Yeah. Yeah.
It is interesting the way you were pointing at this area of the brain as face recognition. I mean, it seems to me, but this is perhaps the view I've now got of how the human brain works, is that you could separate out every bit of the brain and say this is for that task. Is that it feels like it's oversimplistic to me.
Yeah.
And yet I have heard that a lot. This area does this frontal lobe does this, etc.
I mean, again, there's different schools of thought here, and you'll have different academics arguing about this, forever.
It's the same thing as well with sorry, I keep kicking my mic stand. Not very professional from me, is it? I have the same thing with genetics as well. When people identify a particular gene, I think, is it really that simplistic? Because why would genes follow the same sort of we've labelled something with a word. What has a gene got anything to do with that word that we've given to something? Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. And I think the same perspective can be put onto genetics as it can to the brain areas. Yes, those individual brain areas we know mostly support this one thing. They do others as well, but mostly do this thing. But they have to work together with a number of other brain areas to actually successfully complete a process. So although I'm saying this area here is responsible for face recognition, of course, part of the process starts with the eyes and works through, the visual areas of the brain before it gets to there. And then that area needs to interact with areas which are responsible for long-term memory storage. Some of that will be the visual storage of the visual representation. Some of that will be the storage of what we've talked about, all the biographical information, the name information. And that's not all held within this one spot here. It's about how they all work together. And it could equally be the case that all of those brain areas that are responsible for this overarching process of face recognition are intact, but they might not be linked up and doing their job together properly.
So that
and
really
you could say that
complicates
for
things.
genetics as well.
Yeah. That reassures me that you've said that, because I've always heard people saying, this area does this. I think, how can it be that simple? And as you say, there's multiple tasks that are required for any given thing that we label as a task in the real, in our world. Yeah,
and I think for faces, the most remarkable thing about that is that we recognise a face in a split second. It's quicker than a split second. It's I know who that person is. I just know. I look at you. I know who you are. But that doesn't reflect how much of my brain has had to work together to pull all that information. And like I mentioned earlier, it's not just that information. It's given me this live information about how you're feeling today, what you're feeling this second, what your emotional expression is at this particular moment in time. It's changed now. And that is just so absolutely remarkable.
It's phenomenal, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And that shows you how, any part of that process could break down and result in the same outward behavioural symptom of a failure to recognise somebody. But of course it could be any part of all of those things that are happening together.
And the brain is sort of malleable, right? So it develops over time as well. So I guess there must also be something going on with the more you see a person, perhaps the pathways in order to access that information about that person become strengthened, and so that process gets quicker when you recognise some, like your husband or wife or something you see every day. Will that then potentially change how the brain is working in terms of accessing that information because it's now got a shortcut to it, sort of thing? Yeah,
so again, there's different schools of thought here, with some people putting forward the case we're actually born with our face recognition ability. So that is all in place from birth. Which
again, that's another mind-blowing thought for me, that we've got these instincts, that we just know to do.
Yeah, and then on the other hand, others believe, well, okay, we might have some sort of attentional bias at birth which makes us particularly interested and drawn to faces, but it's actually the experience with faces which makes these areas refine and become specialised for face recognition, and then start to come online to start working together. So again, two very different approaches and two very different schools of thought, and we don't necessarily know which is right. As with most things, it's somewhere in the middle.
Probably,
I'm sure.
Yeah. It's always grey, isn't it? It's never the black and white
That's
that some people want it to be. So what you're suggesting is that with the second one you said was that basically we have a series of instincts that just so happened to match up nicely with how we recognise faces as well. Is that what you?
Yeah, and there's all sorts of evolutionary explanations for how that happens. I mean, if you think about where a mother holds an infant to breastfeed, well, it's actually right there, which happens to be the optimal place for the infant to view the mother's face and start to get experience with the face there.
Very true.
So if you speak to an evolutionary psychologist about, the different perspectives on how face recognition develops, there's all sorts of reasons why we might be pre-specified to recognize faces, but that doesn't necessarily mean everyone will reach their full capability. So there's some interesting work out there, for example, which says people who live in smaller towns or who grew up in small villages don't actually have as good face recognition ability as people who've had exposure to many more faces.
For some reason, I thought it would be the other way around. I thought that because they have just a small number of faces to remember, that they then can do that more successfully or something. But
no, so the finding's the other way around.
Right.
And there's also stories about neglected children, so children who've been brought up without much social contact, children in orphanages and so on, who haven't had much interaction with large numbers of people. When they're tested later on in life, they haven't developed full face recognition ability. And interestingly, the same seems to extend to emotional expression recognition as well. So it definitely seems to be this value of exposure to different aspects of face perception, and it's not just about facial identity recognition.